China has been one of the major countries that has shown great enthusiasm in embracing the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. And there's considerable talk about the SDGs within the country. Now, when one thinks of China today, of course, one thinks of these shining skyscrapers in Shanghai. I've taken these photos in 2019 in October, and it is pretty impressive the kind of development that China has achieved in the last 2 decades. This particular area in Pudong in Shanghai used to be a rundown area and has now been transformed into what for many Chinese just showcases their impressive achievements in relation to economic growth, but also poverty reduction. This is the famous CCTV tower in Beijing. When I teach in Beijing, I often, almost on a daily basis, pass through this street, and I've often been taking photos of this over the years. This is a wonderful January 2019, clear sky, blue sky. Everything looks fantastic, but there have also been many instances where you could barely see this building because of the enormous amount of air pollution. So in many ways, China has been keen for many years to showcase its embrace of sustainable development, even among consumers. As you see here in Beijing, there's been much more of a focus on city bikes. Katie Melua had this famous song about 9 million bicycles in Beijing. Ever since I've been coming to Beijing for the last 7, 8 years, I haven't really seen that many bicycles. But and because of economic growth, because of affluence, people were driving more cars. But now you see bikes returning. There's much more focus on healthy lifestyles, etc. What one also sees in Beijing pretty often, in fact, throughout the country, are numerous conferences that talk about green economy, green growth. In fact, it really is the buzzword among many in many situations. So this was one of the many conferences that I attended and I spoke at where I talked about the SDGs to business leaders. Similarly, China organizes numerous major international conferences, as in this economic forum from October 2019 that I was invited to, where the purpose, among other things, was to showcase the Chinese model of development and how this could perhaps help other countries as they strive to achieve development and poverty reduction. So, what is China's position in terms of the SDGs? In numerous policy documents, China makes this case for the sustainable development process, the 2030 agenda, and the SDGs must be open and inclusive. They talk about how important the SDGs are to transform economies such as China's. But China has, not surprisingly, as in many other international forums, in relation to sustainable development, China emphasizes respect of national sovereignty and the diversity of various developmental models. It is important for China to do things their way. They don't really want to be dictated to. And in this case, it is particularly interesting to see the kind of important transition that China has made from being a rule taker, that was the case for many, many decades, to a rule maker that has become the norm of late. So China insists that all countries must, of course, enjoy equal rights to participation, and has taken the lead by creating numerous institutions such as development banks, has been far more active in UN agencies, has tried to influence multilateral agencies, etc. So from a strategy where it was pursuing selective multilateralism, many observers claim that China has embraced multilateralism and has been one of the biggest champions of globalization. But despite this embrace of the world and its interest in multilateralism, it has been one of the strongest proponents of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which basically says that the world should acknowledge the different capabilities and the different responsibilities of individual countries, be it in relation to climate change, be it in relation to any of the SDGs. That different countries have different starting points, and one can't expect countries like China or India or Brazil or poorer countries in the world to bear the same kind of responsibility as more affluent countries of the world. So this has been a very important theme for China, the common but differentiated responsibilities, and countries like India also support this. Now, an important foreign policy initiative for China since 2013 has been the Belt and Road Initiative, often also referred to as the BRI. Now, what is particularly interesting about the BRI is that it has to be seen in a particular context, because a persistent complaint among many world leaders has been that their roads have been in poor state and the ports have been underdeveloped, and the international community, at least in these countries, we're talking about low income countries, has been reluctant to fund infrastructure projects. And this is where, in 2013, China realized that it had an opening to gain much more global influence, but also to put a lot of its own companies into action, a lot of its own capital to good use. So it launched something called the Belt and Road Initiative, a very ambitious project. And it has been estimated to cost over 5 trillion US dollars. So the plan that Beijing has, at least the long-term plan, is to undertake a series of large investments in roads, bridges, but also gas pipelines, railways, ports, telecommunications, power plants, not just in its own neighborhood in Asia, but also in Africa, Latin America, and increasingly China has made inroads in Europe, for example, in the ports of Greece, Italy, etc. So despite the fact that there are countries that are really worried about China's growing power, its true intentions, and there are countries like the United States, Japan, and India have been particularly critical of the Belt and Road Initiative. China has been claiming that these initiatives, these infrastructure projects under the BRI, actually promote new models of international cooperation and global governance. And more importantly, they are extremely important for promoting sustainable development throughout the world. So, in terms of organization and coordination, similar to many other countries, China has located the responsibility in its powerful state council. They've also established something called the interministerial coordination mechanism, where you have influential civil servants and politicians taking part. And China has also gone ahead to establish several governmental think tanks. And one of the think tanks that I've been in contact with, and they've requested for assistance and peer reviewed knowledge from us, is the Center for International Knowledge on Development, called CIKD, established in 2013. And the professed purpose for this think tank is to showcase China's developmental model, but also to coordinate and publish regular progress reports of how China is doing. And from these reports, one actually sees some of the most important elements or crucial components of the Chinese strategy in relation to promoting the SDGs. So China has a national action plan, and one of the key features of this action plan is to promote reforms, and there have been numerous reforms. So in addition to creating new agencies, there are new guidelines that are issued, new legislation covering many aspects of life, covering, for example, the private sector's role, covering many of the social protection programs that have been reformed of late. So there's been this kind of renewed focus in revisiting what has worked, but also tailor making these programs to suit the new SDGs. Now, one of the most important ways in which China has been trying to supplement state activities in relation to, say, poverty, inequality, development is to increasingly get private sector actors to fund projects, not just through regular corporate social responsibility initiatives, CSR, but through much more integrated approaches related to pensions, salaries, workplace conditions, etc. So there are numerous pilot projects taking place all over China by state-owned companies, by private sector actors, where one is trying out new ways of providing health insurance, pensions, etc. Another important strategy, which is related to the Belt and Road, but also its desire for greater influence in world affairs, relates to how China has used um, aid and investments outside its own borders to cultivate more sort of a feeling of solidarity, that China is actually looking out for the interests of other poor countries. And one important strategy here has been under the auspices of the so-called South-South cooperation mechanism, by which China emphasizes that it is interested in maybe not teaching as much as making other countries aware of what has worked in China, and perhaps these other countries can then use some of these experiences within their own borders. So for many years, China has been cultivating what you could in many ways term as development diplomacy. And it is not a new phenomena. For many decades, China has been, for example, very active in Africa, and increasingly so now in other parts of the world. There are numerous mega projects that were built, trains, so railway projects, roads, but also buildings. And you will hear me talk about these in a separate lecture. But the point here is that this has been a very important part of the strategy. And in many parts of the world, for example, in relation to infrastructure projects on energy, China says and has been talking about how it can impart expertise related to renewable energy, hydroelectric power projects, etc., and thereby help other countries achieve their SDGs. So, a crucial part of China's policy has been to basically make the argument that if you support the Belt and Road Initiative, you will support the SDGs. And this has been a very clever strategy for China, because by not supporting it, you're basically saying, according to China, that you don't support sustainable development. So these strategies have been smart for China, but have also been criticized by others. And one of the most important criticisms has been that many poor countries are getting themselves into long-term indebtedness to China, and they're often unable to pay for very expensive infrastructure programs. So in terms of looking at the policy priorities that come out of these strategies, in many UN settings, in its regular reports, China emphasizes that it is very interested in increasing investments to least developed countries, and is going to prioritize those in terms of its development diplomacy. Within the country, China has also often made the case that it is really not a superpower. It is not the most developed. There are actually many, many people. In fact, its own estimates find that around 55, 56 million people in rural areas still live below the poverty line, and lifting these people out of poverty is an important part of China's commitment to the SDGs. So coordinated development between urban and rural areas is important, improving on social security and social services, protecting the environment. All of these are important policy priorities for China. Addressing climate change actively and integrating climate change into national development strategies is prioritized. Much more focused nowadays on renewable energy. And China also says that it is interested in improving national governance and ensuring economic and social development in line with the rule of law. So, given that China is not a democracy, it doesn't really talk about democratic reforms, but it says that in terms of SDG 16, etc., the focus is law and the rule of law and following the law, reforming the law, etc. But all action should follow what is prescribed in legal formulations. Now, China reported in terms of its own national plan. It actually formulated, a national plan for the period 2016 to 2019. And these are some of the things that come out very clearly, that China is interested in giving the impression that it really is not a superpower. It tries to project a humble kind of feeling. It tries to project an idea that it isn't ambitious in terms of seeking global dominance, and by using terms like largest developing country in the world, it tries to convey that kind of a sense of moderation. It is also interested in building on its very successful experience with the Millennium Development Goals. China achieved most of the goals in the period 2000 to 2015. And in terms of promoting this kind of Chinese model of development, it talks about how it has emphasized innovation, how effective it has been in coordinating programs, and that in future it will keep focusing on green strategies, open strategies, but also sharing what has worked, what is not working with others, but all of this under a very sort of peaceful, harmonious umbrella. In terms of its progress report, China said in 2017, it, of course, China says these things, and in many ways it doesn't appear to be too self-critical, but it says things like the economy is sound and it's their steady growth, living conditions have improved, which is generally the case. Of course, there are numerous concerns in many parts of the world that some regions of China remain underdeveloped, particularly in the central and western regions of the country. But according to China's progress report, there has been all-round progress, also in relation to green development, and remarkable achievements in relation to deepening international development cooperation, which is what I mentioned earlier in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative that has been in effect since 2013. China has really stepped up its investments and also aid policies, and thereby has surpassed the United States and many other countries in sort of getting that kind of in achieving influence that it did not have before. In 2019, China issued a new progress report, and basically the focus here was that it has made several attempts to streamline the implementation of the 2030 agenda together with existing programs. So it's this kind of a policy of aligning existing policies to be closely integrated with the 2030 agenda. And if you look at the third point here, it is particularly interesting because it says China is interested in upholding the vision of innovative, coordinated, green, open, and shared development. And in doing so, China is concentrating on promoting quality development. So it's not just any form of development, it is trying to aim for higher types of development outcomes, and has accelerated the implementation of the domestic 2030 agenda, or the domestic implementation of the global 2030 agenda. in terms of achieving so-called early harvest. So this is very similar to also what India has been propagating. That if certain pilot projects work in India, if some things work in China, according to China, these can be then exported to other parts of the world for the greater good. But of course, for both China and India and many other countries, any sort of export of these models is only adds to their growing influence in world affairs. So in the 2019 report by CIKD, there are all kinds of figures where you see progress in relation to poverty reduction. Of course, I mentioned earlier that rural poverty remains a problem, but nonetheless, China makes frequent references to rural poverty and how it has to focus on rural poverty reduction. Similarly, it also showcases achievements in health and many other areas. Here you see a drastic improvement in infant mortality rates in the period 1980 to 2017, and China is doing much better, according to this figure, than many or most upper middle income countries. So in conclusion, what have been the achievements and challenges? I think China has definitely shown considerable enthusiasm for sustainable development. There's a lot of talk about sustainable development. But like many developing countries, many emerging countries, the discourse still focuses largely on economic growth. It is the developmental goals that seem to get priority over environmental goals. Even though there is definitely more talk about environmental goals, it is still the developmental goals that get most of the policy attention. In terms of the Belt and Road, it has definitely made some impact, but there have also been many challenges with the Belt and Road. Many people have pointed out, including me, that the strategy does not seem to be very coordinated. There's not enough information about how countries are being prioritized, on what basis. There is not enough transparency in terms of how contracts for major projects are signed, on what conditions. There are also concerns that Chinese financial institutions are taking most of the risk in terms of lending, and that many other institutions have been very reluctant to join the Belt and Road Initiative. But there's also another side to this. Many international organizations realize, even countries, that they're not in a position to undertake the major infrastructure projects that China is doing. So maybe this is not such a bad thing after all. And you see many European countries joining the movement. But nonetheless, we are not quite sure how this will play out, to what extent the Belt and Road Initiative will be effective in promoting the SDGs, particularly also because there have been accusations that while on the one hand China is promoting environmental friendly or sustainable energy solutions like hydroelectric power plants, it is also building coal-fired power plants, just like the United States in many parts of Africa. So it seems like a double-edged sword, and the kind of policy priorities for the BRI in relation to the SDGs appear a bit inconsistent. China, in its report, in its various reports, also outlines many challenges it faces: inequality, gender inequality, particularly, and also in relation to environment. So this one passage in the 2019 report is very illustrative. I think China could be definitely more self-critical, but here they point to the fact that awareness or a recognition of gender equality is yet to prevail in China, and that women's status definitely requires much more work and improvement to be so women continue to be underpaid, and their roles in society continue to be underappreciated. So all in all, China is showing great enthusiasm for the Sustainable Development Goals, has established institutions, is coming up with frequent reports. There are always concerns about the quality and reliability of the data that China is producing, But by all accounts, China has made major strides in the developmental field. The challenge now is going to be how it integrates development with environment.